Chernobyl had already leaked radiation years before 1986, but every incident was buried. The plant's design flaws were flagged in secret reports, and when the explosion finally happened, Soviet news called it a minor accident, while entire families were outside breathing in fallout. These are disturbing secrets the Soviet Union hid about Chernobyl. Years before the meltdown, Soviet officials already knew the reactors at Chernobyl had dangerous flaws. Reports going all the way to Moscow flagged the RBMK-1000 design as unstable and missing some very important safety features. One of the biggest problems was how the reactor behaved when things didn't go perfectly. Instead of shutting down safely when power levels shifted, it could actually speed up the reaction. This would kind of be like having a car where pressing the brakes sometimes, just made it go faster. Would you ever step into a vehicle like that? Hell no. But, a bunch of nuclear reactors with the power to kill and contaminate everything in the surrounding area and disperse a radioactive cloud across large swaths of Europe? Hey, proceed. Even the emergency shutdown system was janky. The control rods, the things meant to stop the reaction in seconds, had graphite tips that caused a brief increase in power before lowering it. And that tiny delay could be enough for disaster to happen, which is exactly what happened during the 1986 test. On top of that, the reactors didn't have a proper containment dome, the kind of heavy shield you see at Western plants. Once the explosion happened, there was nothing keeping the radiation from going straight into the air, and all of this was written down in safety reviews, but the reports were buried. Acknowledging the flaws would have meant shutting down plants and losing money. And then accidents and emergencies started happening. The Chernobyl explosion in 1986 wasn't some freak accident out of nowhere. As I said, the Soviets already knew the plant was sketchy years before it blew up, and years later, there were declassified documents showing that back in 1982, there was already a radiation leak at the site. People nearby noticed strange illnesses, animals were dying off, but there was no official statement about this. The KGB said their priority was to stop, quote, panic and provocative rumors, which is a fancy way of saying lie to everyone. By 1983, Moscow already had reports labeling Chernobyl as one of the most dangerous nuclear plants in the entire Soviet Union because it lacked basic safety equipment. In 1984, there were more emergencies at the site, again hushed up. So when the 1986 meltdown happened, it was not totally out of the blue. There were years of ignored warnings that had piled up, and even after the reactor exploded, cover-ups kept coming. One of the biggest weapons the Soviet Union used after the explosion was propaganda. When radiation alarms started going off in Sweden and other countries, the Soviet government went on TV and said basically nothing had happened. Newspapers ran tiny, vague blurbs about it that didn't even mention the word explosion. On April 28th, 2 days after the blast, Soviet news finally admitted that there was an accident, but described it like a minor fire instead of, the worst nuclear disaster in history. At the same time, state-controlled media was pumping out stories about all the awesome stuff the Soviets were accomplishing: sports wins, farming statistics, anything to distract from Chernobyl. Even when they couldn't hide it anymore, the language was carefully watered down. Instead of saying thousands exposed to radiation, this is really bad, people will be talking about this for the next several decades, they'd be like, it's no big deal, measures are being taken. Ordinary people living hundreds of miles away had no idea they were eating radioactive food and breathing fallout because the news refused to acknowledge how bad it was. Meanwhile, outside the USSR, scientists were publishing radiation readings that proved just how much the Soviets were lying, but more on that in a bit. When Reactor 4 exploded, the people living in Pripyat had no idea anything was wrong. Pripyat was a city built specifically for the plant's workers and their families, about 50,000 people. When Reactor 4 blew, radiation levels spiked immediately, but instead of getting people out, they told everyone to stay calm and carry on. So the next morning, kids went to school, parents went shopping, people were gardening and fishing while breathing in radioactive dust. The firefighters who rushed in weren't even told how bad it was, and most of them didn't have proper protective gear. By the time buses finally rolled in to take people away, 36 hours later, thousands of people had already been exposed to insane levels of radiation. When they left, they were told to pack light, like it was just for a weekend trip, but most never saw their homes again. Then all that time, the Soviet government was pretending to the outside world that nothing serious had even happened. When word of Chernobyl started to leak, pun intended, tourists and foreign workers inside Ukraine tried to get out. You'd think if the Soviets wanted to avoid attention, they'd quietly let people leave, but instead they locked things down. Train tickets were suddenly unavailable. There were reports of diplomats and foreign engineers being told there were just no seats available, even though half-empty trains were still running. Flights out of Kiev were heavily restricted, and some embassies had to fight to get their staff on planes. But why? Well, because letting a wave of foreigners flee all at once would have confirmed to the outside world that something really bad had happened. By trapping them in place, the Soviets tried to buy themselves time to control the story. Some foreigners later said they noticed soldiers quietly washing vehicles with hoses or strange military convoys moving through the night, but they weren't allowed to leave or ask questions. The irony is that by trying to contain the news this way, the Soviets, they just made everyone more suspicious, right? Other governments suddenly knew something was very wrong when their own citizens couldn't come home. When word of the accident got out, it got out. This was international news, and scientists from around the world wanted to know how bad the contamination really was. Journalists and researchers started taking soil, water, and air samples near Chernobyl to test them independently. Of course, the Soviets hated this because they wanted to keep the scale of the disaster quiet, so the KGB actually set up operations to swap out samples. Yes, for example, in 1987, a French journalist came to investigate and tried to collect soil and water samples. The KGB intercepted him, swapping his samples with clean ones. They also faked data in official reports downplaying the radiation levels to make it seem safer than it really was. It sounds totally conspiratorial, but no, declassified KGB documents did confirm that this was going on. It's part of why, for years, people outside the USSR had no idea how much radiation had actually spread across other parts of Europe. Even countries like Sweden and Germany, which detected the fallout, had to piece the truth together on their own, because the Soviets were covering their tracks. Radiation didn't just hit the soil around the plant, it contaminated crops, livestock, fish, pretty much everything people were eating. The government tried to set up food checkpoints to keep radioactive food off the market, but nothing is foolproof. Farmers and vendors who didn't want to lose money could bribe inspectors to keep selling their tainted produce. Bread made from contaminated grain, meat from exposed animals. All of it ended up in people's homes, and some of it was shipped to other parts of the Soviet Union, so people hundreds of miles away were eating this stuff. The problem is radiation doesn't change the way food looks or tastes. How was anyone really supposed to know? They just trusted what they were buying at the market. Years later, reports started coming out about people developing thyroid cancer and other illnesses, and a lot of that traces back to eating food that should have never been sold in the first place. The first people hit hardest by the explosion were the plant workers, obviously, and firefighters who rushed to the scene. They were exposed to radiation doses so high that some died within just weeks from what's known as acute radiation syndrome, which causes burns, organ failure, and internal bleeding. The Soviet government reported almost none of this. Officially, only 31 people were listed as immediate deaths. This was the official number for years. In reality, hospital wards in Moscow were packed with men who'd been at the reactor site, a lot of them dying slow, painful deaths that never made it into official statistics. And in the years that followed, thousands of cases of thyroid cancer, especially in children, started showing up across Ukraine and Belarus. Doctors who tried to tie these illnesses to Chernobyl were often ignored or silenced. Families were told their loved ones died of pneumonia or heart failure, not radiation sickness. Even today, there's still no universally agreed upon death toll. Could be a few thousand, could be hundreds of thousands. It's hard because a lot of these are cancer cases. One of the biggest things that made Chernobyl so much worse was how unprepared everyone was. We already established that inside the plant there were known problems, but operators had been bending the rules to keep things running. But when the reactor finally blew, the people who rushed in to deal with it weren't even given the right protective gear. Firefighters were sent in wearing nothing but their regular uniforms, spraying water and radioactive material that was burning at insane temperatures. Nobody told them what they were actually up against. Some workers at the plant were ordered to shovel radioactive debris with their bare hands, wearing only cotton clothing. By the time doctors in nearby hospitals started seeing patients, they realized these men weren't just burned from fire, they were showing the classic signs of radiation poisoning. We've mentioned them before in this video, but the Soviet secret police, the KGB, played a huge role in making sure the outside world and their own citizens didn't get the full truth about Chernobyl. Right after the explosion, they were the ones managing what newspapers could print, what TV could report, and what foreign journalists were allowed to see. If soil or water samples came back showing dangerous levels of radiation, the KGB could swap them out or bury the results. They also watched over doctors and scientists, making sure nobody went public with data that showed just how widespread the contamination really was. Inside the USSR, people only heard what the KGB approved, which at first was basically everything's under control. Outside the USSR, they worked just as hard to downplay the scale of it, treating it like a minor industrial accident instead of, again, the worst nuclear disaster in history. All that said, I've been your host, James, and I'll catch you, yes, you specifically, in the next video.